So I think we'll get going. This webinar is being recorded, so we'll send it out to other people later. Just for those of you who are joining, just remind you to put it on a speaker view, and just so that you can see the slides and the speakers as they come through. But just wanted to say a very warm welcome and thank you all for joining this really important discussion about what investors can do to encourage governments to implement the climate and financial policies that are needed ahead of the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow in a few weeks' time. My name's Rebecca Mikula-Wright, the CEO of the Investor Group on Climate Change and the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. And I'm delighted to be joined by Erwin Jackson, our Policy Director at the Investor Group on Climate Change. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're all meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So IGCC and AIGCC, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are two of the founding partners of the Investor Agenda. The other founding partners are the European IIGCC, North American Series, CDP, the Principles for Responsible Investment, and the UNEP Finance Initiative. So the Investor Agenda provides global leadership on the climate crisis, which focuses on accelerating investor action for a net zero emissions economy. The collaboration brings together and coordinates a number of different investor and finance sector initiatives on the climate crisis. Hopefully you're familiar with our work on the Investor Climate Action Plans, or ICAPs, and hopefully you're also engaging in this initiative. The Investor Agenda's other major policy initiative is the Global Investor Statement to Governments on the Climate Crisis, which is obviously the focus of this webinar today. So I'm really pleased to report that we have over 200 signatories to the 2021 statement registered for these webinars that are taking place today across Australia, New Zealand and Asia, and then also later on tonight our time is in the US and European time zones. So over the next hour, we're going to cover what the climate crisis means for investors, the actual 2021 statement to governments on the climate crisis, the power of investor advocacy and what your role can be in advocating to governments, and what the advocacy tools are in the Investor Action Pack that we're going to talk through today. So we'll also have about 15 minutes for discussion, and we're really keen to hear from you about what you've been doing to plan or to advocate for the policy recommendations that are laid out in the Global Investor Statement ahead of the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow, known as COP26. So just a reminder, of course, to please put yourselves on mute. You're welcome to put questions in the chat throughout the presentation, but please save your interventions till the end, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to do that. So just once again, this webinar is being recorded and suggest that you use the speaker view or side by side, depending on which version of Zoom you have. So just to kick off, just a bit of a recap and what the climate crisis means for investors. So I think it's always good to be reminded of, what the latest climate science is telling us, that it is indeed a crisis that we're facing. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a very alarming report in August, which showed that the world is warming at a much faster rate than previously understood. The world is already 1.1 degrees hotter than pre-industrial levels, and we're seeing these devastating impacts play out through the fires in Greece, California, and Australia, Hurricane Ida in the United States, floods in Germany and Belgium, and bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, and generally sea level rise worldwide. So we're rapidly approaching this 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, at which point low-lying countries, such as the small island states in the Pacific, simply won't be able to survive. We're currently on track to reach 1.5 degrees as soon as 2030, and continuing to rise thereafter to about 2.7 degrees by the end of this century. The impacts of climate change will become more frequent and more severe, bringing increasing physical risks to investors' assets. The UN's latest synthesis of countries' 2030 emissions reductions targets, which was released on 17th of September, projects that global emissions to be 16% higher than 2010 levels by 2030. So just to remind ourselves that the IPCC report tells us that we need to remain below 1.5 degrees. And to do this, we need global emissions in 2030 to be 45% lower than 2010 levels. So we're not on track by any means. And we need to reach this net zero emissions before 2050. So the scale of this challenge is enormous. It's going to take trillions of dollars in investment in adaptation, renewable energy, and zero emissions infrastructure and technology. The private sector has a critical role to play in supporting this investment, and investors are a critical part of this solution. So we really appreciate being here today and the role that you are already playing in this. So onto the policy challenge. We know, though, that these policy settings need to be right for investors to channel the trillions of dollars needed to address the climate crisis. Investors need legislated policy signals to invest at scale in emerging technologies and major infrastructure, and coordinated whole of government approach policies to increase certainty around the investment environment. This includes short and long-term emissions reduction targets that will keep warming below 1.5 degrees, sector-level timetables for transitioning, and policies that incentivise zero emissions investment. Corporate climate risk disclosure also needs to be mandatory and consistent with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the work that IGCC and AIGCC have been doing on this quite recently. Financial markets can't properly price and act on the physical and transitional risks of climate change without these clear, consistent and comparable reporting from companies, investors, banks and insurers. Investors are facing this regulatory complexity with the various voluntary and mandatory reporting frameworks around the world. And it would be ideal if all countries were able to implement consistent mandatory regimes which fall in line with the TCFD. So looking at where we're up to in terms of countries and the government policies, unfortunately, many countries and these policies, they're not only insufficient, but they're actually acting as a roadblock to investment. And yes, there've been some positive developments and we need to recognise those, such as the significantly higher 2030 targets announced by the US, Europe and Germany. But as we see on this slide here, according to Climate Action Tracker, there's actually only one country in the world whose climate action is consistent with 1.5 degrees, which is the Gambia. The UK is the only G20 country whose 2030 target is considered to be 1.5 degree compatible, but its policies and international support don't match this. Australia, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, New Zealand, Russia, Singapore, Switzerland, Vietnam have all failed to lift their ambition at all ahead of Glasgow, submitting the same or even less ambitious 2030 targets than they put forward in 2015. Many G20 countries' 2030 targets or policies are consistent with over 3 and up to 4 degrees of warming. These include India, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, South Korea, Argentina and Canada. And many of these G20 countries still have not committed to net zero emissions by mid-century, including Australia, India, Russia, Indonesia and Saudi Arabia. So looking at the progress of the G20 countries on mandatory climate risk disclosure policies, it's only the UK and EU that have implemented this mandatory disclosure in line with the TCFD. And in several countries, India, Russia, Indonesia, South Korea, and others have no mandatory disclosure policies at all. The governments really need to urgently address these policy roadblocks if we're to have any chance of avoiding the worst effects of climate change. But this is where investors come in. So in 4 weeks' time, world leaders will come together at the G20 summit in Rome, followed by COP26 in Glasgow, where they'll be expected to put their best foot forward in responding to the climate crisis, especially the major emitters. Businesses, investors and civil society need to put sustained pressure on governments in the next few weeks to make it politically untenable for world leaders to come to Glasgow without meaningful and ambitious climate policy commitments. So coming to the statement itself and what we're here to talk about today. So the Investor Agenda's 2021 Global Investor Statement to Governments on the Climate Crisis is a really powerful tool to help you as investors influence governments to make these policy changes. So far, we have over 600 investor signatories from all over the world, collectively managing more than 46 trillion in assets under management, which represents about 40% of global assets under management. So getting, as I'm sure you can appreciate, getting over 600 investors of different sizes from all different regions to agree to a single policy statement to governments is a really big endeavour for the networks. But it highlights that good climate policy, is a priority for investors, no matter which part of the world they're from, and that policy change and action is really needed urgently. So in terms of what the recommendations from the statement are, just to recap this, so we're asking 5 key points. So to strengthen the 2030 emissions targets to align with 1.5 degrees or less of warming, commit to net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner, and then implement effective domestic emissions reductions policies, especially for emissions intensive sectors, and ensure that there's just transition plans for affected workers and communities to make this a reality. And we need to see investment in complementary COVID-19 economic recovery stimulus measures. And finally, to implement mandatory climate risk disclosure in line with the TCFD. So back to, hopefully many of you have already joined the statement, and hopefully we'll get more people to sign up to the statement still. But I really want to congratulate everybody, pardon me, that signed on to the statement, and of course encourage others that haven't done so yet to reach out to us and discuss any hesitations or internal discussions that we can help you with to try and get your organisation across the line. The statement does remain open to signatories until the 20th of October, before the statement and the final list of signatories is showcased at COP26. So now I'm going to hand over to Erwin to talk about how investors can use the statement as a platform for advocacy and to urge governments to improve their climate policies ahead of COP26. Thanks so much, Erwin.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and good morning, afternoon, everyone on the call. So as Rebecca said, governments need to be put under sustained pressure in the lead up to Glasgow to address the policy roadblocks that we see across all markets and jurisdictions. And importantly, Glasgow was a really key political moment when media, voters, people around the world will be paying close attention to what governments are doing to address the climate crisis and to ensure that that's effectively being managed. The other important thing that will be happening, of course, and we're already starting to see this, is countries will be compared to one another, and that there'll be peer pressure on countries to put their best foot forward to ensure that all countries are stepping up together to ensure that we can be on a pathway towards 1.5. Glasgow, therefore, is a really major opportunity to secure policies needed for investors to channel the $1 trillion into a sustainable future. And this, of course, does not just relate to the global announcements and global statements that we'll see around Glasgow, because once after the COP, of course, governments will need to go away and do intense work and ongoing work about how they're going to implement the commitments they've made in Glasgow within their domestic policy frameworks. The UN climate conferences are also not just about politicians and government officials where they get together and negotiate deals. There's also very significant non-government engagement, whether it be from business, civil society groups, investors. So we see hundreds of non-government organisations attend the climate negotiations as observers. These stakeholders can help build positive momentum behind the scenes in the negotiations, but also publicly, which can support positive outcomes from the negotiations. They provide opportunities for participants and observers to put on side events where they can see close up what's happening within the negotiations, and also show and showcase the work that they're doing on addressing climate change. And what we see is that the statements from investors and the statements from the global investor statement are very important in that context. So we've seen, for example, on a number of occasions, the UN Secretary General highlight previous global investor statements at key moments of international diplomacy to highlight that investors are saying to governments with a single voice that they need to be more ambitious. At the COP this year is obviously going to be a bit different because of the situation that we're in with COVID, and there will be opportunities to participate in the COP in a hybrid nature. So, for example, the Investor Agenda will be hosting a side event at the COP's Finance Day on the 3rd of November, which will provide opportunities to highlight the signatories to the Global Investor Statement, the actions they've undertaken, and the broad support that investors can give to governments to undertake more effective policies. Now, what is the role of investors in all of that? So in the lead up to Glasgow, it's not just about NGOs and civil society putting pressure on governments to step up efforts. Investors have an incredibly powerful voice and influence on national governments because they're one of the key facilitators of global capital. Investors have the finance that is needed to address the climate crisis. You know, we have the trillions that governments are going to need to build resilience in their systems and invest in adaptation, all the way through to investing in new and large-scale deployment of new technologies. And obviously, the groups that I work for, like Investor Group on Climate Change, all the other investor network partners of the Investor Agenda, we do a lot of work ourselves in engaging with governments on these issues. But you cannot underestimate how influential it can be for when investors get into the rooms with government officials to talk about the challenges that they have, to talk about the opportunities that are available with strong climate policy, but also to put themselves out publicly to ensure that governments understand the real important needs that investors have to unlock the trillions that are available. And I just wanted to give one very quick example of this. The Investor Agenda partners in Australia have been working very hard collectively to engage with the government on policy issues here. And we've hosted a number of roundtables privately with government, with senior investors. And I acknowledge the people on this call from the investment community have helped us in that process. And what we have seen in Australia over the last 6 months is, even in a very difficult policy environment, we've seen the Prime Minister of Australia, we've seen the Treasurer of Australia highlight the importance of getting an ambitious national policy in place so that Australia can remain competitive in global markets. And just yesterday, we also saw Australia's largest state, New South Wales, commit to reducing its emissions by 50% by 2030. The key justification given was that the state wanted to remain competitive in global capital markets to attract the investment that we have available on clean energy solutions. So I just use those as just two examples of how the investor voice can be very influential in influencing national policy. So most of you will have all signed up to the Global Investor Statement of this year. And what we're really looking for now is to sort of amplify the voice that we have. We have at the moment over 600 potential ambassadors within the Global Investor Statement, which can help build advocacy and build ambition in advance of the COP. There are various ways that investors can promote the Global Investor Statement on the climate crisis. Investors can promote it through their social media, their website, member newsletters. Investors can actively pursue meetings with policymakers, the media, to push governments to implement its policy recommendations. Investors can underline their commitment to the statement by committing to net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner, and reporting under climate risk, TCFD, and implementing and developing comprehensive investor climate action plans. If you're keen to be involved, we also have a toolkit to make this all easier for you. So hopefully you've all already received the toolkit. Just to highlight, if you haven't, then please put out a request to us and we can make sure that you have it. But the toolkit involves a few things. There's a template media release, which you could publish on your company website to highlight that you are one of the 600 investors that have signed the Global Investor Statement. We've included a template letter or email to policymakers to encourage them to respond to the statement's recommendations in policies in advance of Glasgow. There are talking points that you could use in meetings with policymakers and the media. And there's also a broad range of social media assets you can promote the statement through and its recommendations through on platforms like Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. And we've actually also been really happy to see many of some of the partners involved and some of the signatories involved already starting to use the tools that are available. So, for example, we've seen CalPERS promoting it. We've seen Castlefield promoting it on social media. I know many of our members within the investor group on climate change have been using it on LinkedIn and promoting it on LinkedIn. So really thankful to all who've been doing that already. And the investor agenda and its founding partners aim to sort of publicly highlight also the advocacy efforts that investors are making to encourage governments and its recommendations. And so, for example, at the side event later in the year. And that's it for me.
Great, thanks, Owen. So I think now this is the time to have some discussion and answer any questions that you might have about the statement, the Investor Action Pack, and how you can use it. But as I put in the chat, it'd be really great to hear from any of you if you're keen to sort of just put your hand up on some of the policy advocacy activities that you've been involved with. I think it's really useful for other investors to hear about the work you've done. If you want to talk about why, but I just think it's useful to see, you know, the different approaches and potentially in different markets. So, so happy for people to use the raising your hand function if you would like to provide an example for the rest of the group, or feel free to type in the chat button there. So it's relatively straightforward. I think, you know, you might have already seen on LinkedIn, we did a LinkedIn takeover. I think it was just last week, in fact, during New York Climate Week. So all the networks that are partners of the investor agenda, we changed our photo background on LinkedIn to some of the motives that you've seen there, and just sort of saying in your title of your role that I'm a supporter of the investor agenda, in addition to your role, obviously, just to really sort of raise that awareness. So there's just a few examples, and we're happy to take you through, kind of walk you through how to do that, whether it's in your own personal profile, if that's helpful, or arguably some of your internal comms teams can help you do that as well. But did anyone have any questions on how to use the action pack, or questions on COP, or some of the activities that are going on there? So a question from Angie Sorrell. Owen, I might see if you want to answer this one, if you can come back on camera. Just, are we getting the sense that COP26 will turn things around?
Well, this COP is a very different COP, putting aside the COVID situation, because all previous COPs that we've had really been around negotiating agreements or negotiating major bits of text. This COP is not about that. This COP is about the testing, the core function of the Paris Agreement, which is countries coming together, putting peer pressure on each other to step up ambition collectively. So what we're seeing at the moment is a real run through. We've never really seen this before at this kind of scale. And I think the observation that I would make is that the other thing that's changed is that a lot of the conversations that we're seeing in countries across all markets has really shifted in this COP, because now policymakers are increasingly talking about that this is the biggest economic opportunity of this century, and that is driving their policy decisions. So we're seeing a shift, I think, across lots of markets, in part because of the dynamics of what's happening around the COP, are actually driving, more ambitious policy. And we're actually starting to see, and I think what we're also starting to see is that is actually being driven by capital markets and investors themselves. It's the signals that investors are sending to governments, to companies on what their needs are in terms of unlocking capital to get to net zero, which is actually, I think, one of the major drivers behind why we're starting to see a real shift in the global conversation and a race to the top as opposed to the race to the bottom.
Thanks, Owen. And there's another question around the significance of Frydenberg's speech last week, and how that might be sort of impacting things within the current government deliberations.
Well, I think, again, it just goes back to the point I'm making, is that because, for example, after Australia did its budget this year, the government obviously goes out and talks to the market about sovereign bonds. And for the first time, what we saw in that feedback was that about 30% of the investors they talked to were either asking questions about what are the availability of green bonds in Australia? And the answer in Australia is the government doesn't issue them, so there's none. And what are the broad policy settings that you have within Australia that would encourage us to invest? And I think that's just one example of how those kinds of conversations that are being had are starting to impact on policy. And there's, again, I just don't want to highlight in Australia, like we've seen significant moves from the Korean central bank yesterday. We're seeing moves in Japanese markets, Singapore. This is not isolated here. This is something that I think we're observing globally.
And I mean, I might just add to that, that, we're starting to see, very quickly how, the sort of the signals setting targets and commitments that are coming from, national governments like the China, coal phase out policy, immediately the Bank of China followed through and said that they would implement the same policy. And similarly, I think Tokyo Marine, a Japanese insurer, then following the lead of the Japanese commitment to phase out coal as well. So we're starting to see the national policies flow through to the corporate level. And we expect to see sort of more of those in each of those sort of respective markets as that sort of flow through effect. Just seeing another comment here. One thing that needs to happen for institutional investors is a strong link being forged between fiduciary duty and climate change, that investing in the best financial interests of members is the same as investing for climate change. That's probably more of a comment. But yes, I think we would definitely agree with that. And I think that's a general recognition that investors are having. And that's obviously a point that we're trying to make very clear as in our discussions with governments, in our advocacy with governments, and indeed, providing those examples of where investors and how how they see these linkages. And it's actually the economic benefits and the environmental benefits, can be kind of recoupled if you look at the decoupling that's happened between economic growth and emissions, for example. So we are seeing examples of how we can have those two things linked and delinked as they also need to be. And I see another comment here. South Korean financial firm, impact fund and management stocks have to invest stocks and bonds which are investing eco themes such as solar power company, which is changing manufacturing system to green. I think that eliminating brown industries make to decrease financial market. What do you think about? The government of Korea is warning that. Yeah, did you want to, Dongjun Lee, did you want to come on and just talk to your sort of your question and your comment briefly? No, maybe not.
If I'm interpreting a question, one of the things that I'd probably say in terms of the policy environment in this regard is that the transition pathways are really, really important from the government's point of view. And I think this is the challenge that we have. If we can get the policy settings right, we get the pathways forward, we get the good national policies in place, then the transition within those industries from brown to green will be equally as important as the investment in the new emerging technologies. And I think that's actually, and this is where I think the just transition element of the global investor statement is also very important, because bringing those communities along, supporting those communities is going to be really, really important in enabling the transition to happen in an orderly way.
Yeah, thanks, Erwin. And I think it's interesting on the just transition point, certainly some discussions that we're having with investors in Asia. So the just transition is something that investors are very cognizant of and are really factoring that into into their policies, their portfolios, their investments, their engagements with companies. But we do also recognise that in different markets, certainly in the Asia region, it may not be as high a priority in some markets than others. And so obviously investors, it depends on, which companies or that you're engaging with, where that may or may not be more relevant, and there might be higher priority things to have initial discussions with. But it's really interesting to hear from investors, in India, for example, that while this is a very new topic of conversation, it's very relevant, and they're really, some of these very large emitting companies are really embracing this and seeing that they really need to look into this. And it's because investors have put it on the table that they're saying, okay, this is really key to the transition, and really creating that partnership and that dialogue with investors through their engagements to really increase their understanding, and investors to highlight, what their expectations are of these companies, over time in this area. Seeing a few more comments that have come in, and thanks Nicolette for popping in that that link there to Jeff Summerhayes. And really, there's a number of different links and documents available about fiduciary duty and addressing climate risk, for directors and trustees in their portfolios. Is someone, Angie Sorrell, you said you had a question. Did you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So the question is around divestiture and engagement. At some point, I understand why engagement is important, but at some point, I think we need to perhaps cut our losses, right? And at what point do we do that when especially now we're seeing with the information that was in your slides earlier, showing that we're not going to meet the targets at the rate that we're going now. So it means that as we get closer to that, there's going to be much more significant impact to actually bring it into line. And so that's going to have to cause divestitures. And how do you do that? And also still try to engage and for the just transition to move those people in the direction that they're supposed to be. It's quite a dichotomy, I think, at this stage.
I'll let Beck answer the sort of investor practice question, but I actually just wanted to make a really important policy point on this one, because one of the things that we found in our engagement with government, and with the corporate engagement work that the various networks do, of course. This whole idea that policy uncertainty is really important to avoid the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because at the moment, it's almost as if investors are being forced to use all these inefficient instruments to actually to protect their portfolios, things. So with the clarity of policy, we can actually start to have the better conversations with the companies about, you want to invest, okay, we've got the money, we want to invest. But at the moment, without the policy, those conversations become harder and harder and harder, which I think is a really important message that investors should be giving to government.
Thanks, Owen. And I think we saw, obviously an example of that with AGL recently at their AGM. It's an example of exactly what Owen was talking about, a disorderly transition. The relevant policy settings were not in place for the company. And this has sort of forced investors to get to the point where, the earnings of the company and the share price and the returns got to the point where investors were sort of forced to act in that way. But I think, every investor has a different, every investor thinks about this in their own way. And I think it is a bit of a conundrum. And obviously you've got investors at all parts of that spectrum. And I think it's about, looking at what are the internal thresholds that you might have to, if it gets to the point of divestment, but what is your escalation strategy to get to that point, and over what time frame is also really important to consider. And if divestment is actually that sort of endpoint, and what comes before that, voting shareholder resolutions and so on. And obviously there is the Climate Action 100+ initiative, which is obviously an incredibly powerful tool to bring investors together at a global level and asking the world's biggest emitters to transition their business strategies in line with the Paris Agreement. And we now have 2/3 of those companies setting net zero goals, which is great. And that's a great signal. And now we're drilling down into, okay, well, what does that look like for 2030 and the more immediate transition in that next decade? And then we've brought in the net zero investment benchmark to really get incredibly granular around what are the very specific asks across a range of different indicators to really help companies see the path that they need to get on and what the expectations are from investors in a very sort of open and transparent way. So that initiative has had, a great deal of success in really driving down the emissions of, that about nearly 80% of global emissions represented by those companies. And there was, and so we've got a lot of very ambitious plans, for that initiative, and really looking at the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but then obviously working further on those scope 3 emissions reductions, which are going to be really critical to continue to drive down those the emissions of those particular companies. There's another comment in here about Morrison's flagged that he may not go to Glasgow, and what are the consequences for Australia if he can't agree to a commitment and attend this event?
I'm prepared to bet an expensive bottle of anything that he will go. It would be an extraordinary thing for an Australian Prime Minister to do, to not, if there's 100 other world leaders there or 100 other more and plus world leaders there, for him not to go. And if he doesn't go, it'll just be interpreted by the international community as Australia not being prepared to stand up and join with them in advancing in global efforts, and it will send a very bad signal diplomatically. I think the important point about Australian policy at the moment is that I think it's shifted and very dynamic. I think I wouldn't read, like, we see lots of media reports about where political parties are on this issue, both in Australia and overseas. I wouldn't read too much necessarily into those, because there's a lot going on behind the scenes within government at the moment to try and actually come up with a more credible international position. They still haven't made the decision yet. Our expectation would be that they're very likely to commit to net zero by 2050, given all of the Australian states have. The real issue for Australia is what they will do about their 2030 target. They're not going to be able to say nothing on it internationally. It's just a question about whether they send a really clear commitment. And I think this will create a real challenge for Australia in terms of the consequences for investment, because if we don't get a stronger target from Australia in the lead up to Glasgow, then the gap between where the Australian market is and where the rest of the global market is going is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, which is going to create real challenges, I think, for investors. And this is what we're already hearing from our members in investments going forward in this country.
Thanks, Owen. I'm keen to just see if anyone is still, interested in sharing any of their policy advocacy work. But while I don't see any other comments or questions in the chat at the moment. But just while we wait to see if there's anything further from anyone, just a couple of quick reminders for IGCC members. The upcoming October member meeting on the 13th of October is a COP-themed member meeting. So that has the Ambassador of the European Union and Senator Andrew Bragg, the Liberal Senator for New South Wales, to talk about COP26 and how, again, sort of more of the policy discussion and investors and policymakers in the lead up to the COP event. So I encourage you to join that. And for AIGCC, we'll also continue to provide sort of COP updates, and the October member meeting for AIGCC members will be releasing and launching our ASEAN emissions report. So that should be really interesting, with a few guest speakers for that as well. And also just to say that it's possible there'll be a few other events around COP. It is sort of, this is quite normal that we don't necessarily have all the details, all the dates and times yet, but the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative is looking to host an event there as well. And we'll let you know as soon as we have sort of dates and times. And obviously these are all hybrid events, as Erwin said, so we'll make them sort of all available and let you know when they'll all be in that lead up. But that's another event that we've just heard about that's in the works at the moment.
Beck, it might be,
Yes.
I know some of the other investor agenda partners are on the call. So I know actually whether Daniel actually wanted to introduce himself, given he's new, but also if there's anything that PRI or any of the other partners want to raise, like you just.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, did anyone from PRI want to jump on? Daniel, are you there? Did you want to come onto camera and say hello? Maybe dropped off now. Can't see him in there. No, nothing from PRI. CDP? No. Okay. All right. Excuse me. All right. Well, if there's no further questions, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. And please come back to us if you have any questions or need any assistance with using the Investor Action Pack. Obviously happy to talk through any of that with you, and really want to thank you for joining on to the statement. And if you need any help with joining onto the statement, get in touch with any of us, and really appreciate your support. And please do use the investor pack. It's really useful just to send this really constant drumbeat in whichever market you happen to be from. It's really important to keep up the pressure on governments to really update their 2030 targets and their ambition ahead of COP. So we really encourage you to really leverage your power as investors to push this global statement forward, and to really put your position out there as investors and what you need to help invest in this transition going forward. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much, and we'll let you go a bit early today, get some time back, but take care and look forward to speaking to you soon. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining today.